Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about the movie Hellbound, Hellraiser 2 on Blu-ray. This was another fine release from Arrow Video, which has gone to become the equivalent of the Criterion Collection when it comes to re-releasing horror movies. And this movie came out in 1988, and it was the first sequel to Clive Barker's horror classic from 1987, Hellraiser. So the first time I watched this movie back in the early 2000s, I didn't really care for it that much, mainly because as a fan of the original movie, I felt that there were certain plot developments from that movie that carried over into this one that were kind of mishandled. But fast forward several years later, wherein I have a chance to reevaluate both Hellraiser and Hellbound, I ended up liking Hellbound a lot more the second time around. Not to a point where I'd say it was a good movie, but at the very least it was a solid sequel, albeit not without flaws, that does a lot to expand the lore of the Hellraiser mythos. And there were some changes when it came to the creative team behind the scenes of making this movie. You have Clive Barker, who was still involved at this point, but rather than writing and directing Hellbound like he did with the first movie, which was in turn based on his own novella, The Hellbound Heart, Clive Barker stepped down from the director's chair and took a spot as an executive producer. But he did come up with the story for this movie, and said story had a screenplay which was written by Pete Adkins. And so you also have a guy named Tony Randel, who had done some work on the first movie, stepping into the director's chair this time around, making his directorial debut. But you do have some familiar faces returning. You have stars Ashley Lawrence and Claire Higgins returning as their respective characters, and you also have the actor Doug Bradley returning as the lead Cenobite. And the Cenobites themselves also get a good amount of more screen time in this movie than they did in the first movie. But you also have composer Christopher Young returning once more from the first movie to deliver yet another wonderful score. And you also have the returning director of photography, Robin Vidgeon, doing a wonderful job in making this movie look good. So before I get into the plot of the movie, I do need to mention that there are going to be some spoilers for the first movie that are kind of inevitable when it comes to discussing the plot for Hellbound. So if you've not seen the first Hellraiser movie, I would highly recommend checking it out, or at the very least either reading a couple of reviews or watching a couple of reviews. And I'll even put the link to the review I did for Hellraiser in the link in the description below, or in a link in a description below. So, okay, getting into the plot of Hellbound. Hellbound picks up shortly after the end of the first movie, wherein the character of Kirsty was the sole survivor of her family after having gotten involved with the Cenobites. And unfortunately, her father, Larry, was an innocent victim that was caught up in all of it. But the characters of her uncle Frank and her stepmom Julia got their just desserts, since they were the ones who were involved in a rather malevolent scheme to bring Frank back to life by way of seducing and murdering men. But once Kirsty accidentally got involved with the Cenobites, the timetable was stepped up, and Frank and Julia murdered Kirsty's father, Larry. And Frank took his own brother's skin and tried to masquerade as him. But Kirsty ended up seeing through it, and as a result, the Cenobites, got involved to reclaim their new toy, as it were, and took Frank and Julia back into their realm, since Julia had had a hand in helping Frank out. And so, Kirsty is, when we see her at the start of the movie, is in a mental institution called the Channard Institute. And the authorities, they know that something has happened with her and her family, because they found multiple bodies of Frank and Julia's victims at the Cotton household. But when she starts telling them about skinless people walking around, as well as creatures from another dimension, they're thinking that, okay, something obviously happened here, but this girl's traumatized. She's not making any sense. But she keeps trying to warn them that the mattress that Julia died on needs to be destroyed, because even though she doesn't know everything about what went down with the Cenobites and Frank, she was able to pick up enough to where she realizes that the mattress that Julia died on could possibly be used to bring her back. And so she's trying to tell the detectives interviewing her that the mattress needs to be destroyed. But this little bit of information is overheard by the head of the institute, Dr. Channard, who manages to persuade the authorities to have the mattress delivered to his home, because it turns out that he actually has a bit of an obsession with the occult. And he's also been trying to pursue the Lamarckian configuration for some time. He's been able to gather information as to where it's been over the years, as well as who's come across it. And so, in the meantime, Kirsty, she's stuck at the institute, but she makes friends with this autistic mute named Tiffany, who's exceptionally skilled in solving puzzles. And so even though she doesn't talk, she is receptive to Kirsty's friendship. And she also makes friends with one of the hospital orderlies, a gentleman named Kyle, who is working under Channard as kind of an intern, but he also is sympathetic to Kirsty's plight. I mean, how often, it's not every day you have a family tragedy where you're the only survivor. And so, even though he doesn't necessarily believe her, I mean, he sympathizes with her. But, she's trying to tell him about the mattress as well. And so Kyle, he figures out that the mattress is being taken to Channard's house, and he's kind of like, wait a minute, why would he want the mattress? And so, while Kirsty is at the institute, Kyle breaks into Channard's house and tries to figure out what's going on, because he figures that something's up when he learns that the mattress that Kirsty was talking about is being delivered to his house. And so as he's looking around, I mean, he's finding all this, sort of supernatural memorabilia, or at least, notes and stuff pertaining to the supernatural. He's like, what the hell is, Dr. Channard gotten into? Or what has he been involved in this whole time? And right about then, that's when Channard comes home. And so Kyle hides in one of the rooms, behind a curtain. And unfortunately, though, that's the room that Channard comes in. And he brings with him a mental patient, a guy who, is forced to wear a straitjacket because, he's constantly hallucinating that, he's got bugs crawling in his body. And so, he's, constantly clawing at his skin, and ripping his skin off, trying to get the bugs out. Well, Channard brings the guy into the room where the mattress is and where Kyle's hiding, and sets the guy down and takes his straitjacket off. And once more, the guy starts picking at himself. And so Channard hands the poor guy, a straight razor, and the guy goes to town, starts slicing himself up. And sure enough, the blood being spilled on the mattress where Julia died is enough to bring her back from the other side. And so she gruesomely devours the guy, leaving him a withered and drooling and vomiting husk. And at this point, Kyle's seen enough. And so while all the chaos is going on, he's able to get out by way of the window. And so he makes it back to the institute and tells Kirsty that what he saw, and tells her that she was right, and he doesn't know what they're planning, but that they have to stop him. And he believes her about Julia now. And in the meantime, Channard is helping Julia to restore herself by replenishing her with several mental patients from his facility. And she's gradually taking on her original form, as far as her skin, coming back with skin and what have you. But she's been changed by her time in hell, to where even though she looks like her normal self, she's strong and is easily able to overpower ordinary humans. And so at this point, Channard and Julia decide to bring Tiffany into their scheme, because what they want to do is have Tiffany open one of the Lamartian configurations that Channard has in his collection. And it turns out there are multiple configurations that I guess have been found throughout the world at some point or another, and the configuration from the first movie was just one of many. But anyway, though, they bring Tiffany to Channard's house and have her solve the configuration in order to summon the Cenobites and also open a doorway to hell, which Channard has been wanting to explore for most of his life now. And so prior to that, though, Kirsty and Kyle were able to get into the house, after Kyle gets Kirsty out of the mental institution. And unfortunately, though, they split up, and Kyle ends up meeting Julia, and Julia ends up killing him and easily overpowering Kirsty once she finds Kyle's dead body, and knocks her out. And so after Kirsty's knocked out, Julia and Channard enact their scheme with Tiffany and have her solve the configuration, and sure enough, a doorway to hell is opened, and the Cenobites emerge, and they're about to work their pleasures on her, but Pinhead stops them, saying that it is not hands that call us, it is desire. Basically, he knows that he's able to pick up on the fact that while yes, she opened the box, it wasn't something she did of her own free will. It was something that she was compelled to do by someone else. Like, she's basically a blank slate. There's no desire in her. It's just, ooh, puzzle, open it. And so he senses that the desire came from someone else. And so he takes the rest of the Cenobites with him, back into hell. But the portal to hell remains open long enough for Tiffany to toddle along after Pinhead. Just, hey, new friends, new place to explore. And so she ends up, going into hell after the Cenobites. And Kirsty, once she comes to, finds the room where all this went down and sees the portal, and she sees Tiffany, going, into hell. And so she goes into the portal as well. But she has a more personal reason for wanting to go to hell besides rescuing Tiffany. Because in her time at the institution, she's been besieged by very terrifying visions of her skinless father writing on the wall in his own blood, "I am in hell, help me." And sure enough, her poor father was a victim of her Uncle Frank and her stepmom Julia, and Frank had in fact taken his skin. And when Kirsty last saw her father, he was skinless. His body was literally skinless, and so she sees these visions of this skinned body writing on the wall, and she realizes that her father somehow is trapped there. And so she had persuaded Kyle to help her get to Channard's house, so that way maybe they can not only stop Julia from being resurrected, but also try and open the door to hell for her to save her father. But that didn't quite go as planned, obviously. So Kirsty goes into hell, before the portal closes, and finds herself wandering this labyrinthian landscape, as does Tiffany. And the landscape seems to, constantly shift and change in terms of, say, the people, exploring it. And for example, Tiffany, she's met with this, horrifying, distorted carnival, and Kirsty is just constantly besieged by endless corridors and that are constantly shifting. And then you have the Cenobites who find her, and at first they're threatening to take her with them. And I mean, in the sense that she escaped them the first time, and they're actually happy to see her because this time she's in their realm and they get to play with her. But when she says that she didn't summon them, she didn't open the box, even though she has the box which Tiffany had dropped, they're easily able to take it away from her, so she can't try and use it again. But she's telling them she didn't open the box this time, and she's not there for them. I mean, she's there to try and find her father. And so this causes the Cenobites to start, laughing, and Pinhead tells her that, her father is in his own private hell and quite unreachable. But since she went to the trouble of coming into the realm, she's free to explore. After all, they have eternity to know her flesh. So they let her go. And in the meantime, Julia is leading Channard on his own tour of hell, and he sees the god of this hell. It's this big diamond, like structure called the Leviathan, which just hovers over this landscape, this labyrinthian landscape, and is casting this black light out everywhere it turns. And whenever the black light hits someone, basically they're hit with their most traumatic memories. And with Tiffany, since she's exploring this landscape as well, and she comes across Leviathan, when she got hit with the black light, we see these traumatic memories of hers where, as a kid, she was obsessed with puzzles, sure, but unfortunately, though, her mother, who had approached Dr. Channard to try and help her daughter, was murdered by Dr. Channard, and Channard abducted Tiffany and did some experiments on her brain to make her more pliable when it came to his scheme to open a portal to hell using one of the Lamarchian configurations. And so, that's Tiffany's story. And then when the black light hits Channard, when he and Julia are exploring hell, we see that ever since he was a kid, he was evil and twisted. And so, he starts freaking out because he can't handle it. And so Julia's, taunting him, saying, well, you want to see, you want to know. And she pushes him into this machine that turns him into a Cenobite, and she's telling him, now you know. Like, basically, the power of hell. And so, he's forcibly turned into a Cenobite in a really painful manner, in a really gruesome manner, too. And, once he comes out of the machine, I mean, he is a whole new being, literally. And the Leviathan takes a liking to him and has this appendage, come up from below, this sort of tentacled appendage, and plunge into his brain, so that way he can be a direct tool of focus for the Leviathan. And he travels about the landscape. And so, in the meantime, Kirsty, figures out that her father was not the one who sent these, horrifying visions to her in the mental institution, but it was in fact Uncle Frank, who is in his version of hell, and he basically was able to, send these images to her in order to, trick her into coming to hell to try and rescue her father, when in fact he basically just wants to use her as a sex slave, because it turns out he had kind of a thing for his own niece. And so, going back, to the first movie. And so, so at the very least, she finds out, what the cause of these visions was. And in the meantime, she's actually saved by Julia in an odd twist of fate when she comes in and literally rips Frank's heart out, because he's the one who murdered her in the first movie. So you have that bit of, revenge there. And so with Julia and Dr. Channard, basically being the movers and shakers of hell now, under the thrall of Leviathan, you now have, Kirsty and Tiffany, trying to escape them, but also, trying to escape the looming presence of and threat of the Cenobites. And so this is a rather, fascinating sequel, because it it has a good start, and it's building to something. The parts where Kirsty's in the mental institution, and she's trying to warn people about the mattress of where Julia died, and as well as her friendships with Tiffany and Kyle. I mean, they make for some rather good plot threads. And unlike, say, the character of Steve, who was her boyfriend in the first movie, the character of Kyle actually has some depth and substance to him and comes across as a very likable fellow. And he's played by William Hope, who is arguably most known for playing Lieutenant Gorman from Aliens. And he does a pretty good job here, and he definitely has a much more I guess I could say a little bit more of a heroic role this time around, in a sense of, say, someone who's trying to do the right thing and help someone out, but unfortunately, well, he ends up running afoul of Julia. And so the one bad thing with his character is that, I mean, we get enough time to where we have a sense of development and everything, and he comes across as very likable, and so when he gets killed, it sucks, because we actually kind of started like this guy. And so I just think that it would have been nice if, say, Kyle had lasted longer. And I'm not objecting to him dying or anything like that, but maybe if he had been able to make it through the portal with Kirsty, and maybe he had run afoul of one of Hell's horrors or something like that. But as far as the character of Tiffany goes, I really liked her character. An actress named Imogen Borman played her, and I thought that she did a really good job of playing someone who was not only mute but was mentally stunted. As we found out, it was because of Dr. Channard's experiments on her. But I mean, she does a good job of playing someone who is in kind of a dumb state, but at the same time, she has enough sense of mind to say, make friends with Kirsty, or I should say appreciate the sense of friendship that she has with Kirsty. And so when we see her exploring hell by herself, we're kind of concerned about her, because I mean, this is an innocent child who is wandering around hell, and she's being subjected to the torment of all these visions and what have you. And so on one hand, yes, the Cenobites left her alone because she was an innocent pawn, but at the same time, she literally wanders into hell, so she is definitely at risk. And unfortunately, yeah, she's definitely in danger when it comes to the character of Channard, because he has an obsession with her. But yeah, I really liked her character, and she definitely made for an interesting dynamic when it came to, say, our eyes and how we see hell through her eyes too, and her dynamic with Kirsty, and also, of course, Ashley Lawrence, she comes back as Kirsty, and she does a good job here, and she has a more of a heroic quality in this movie this time around, as opposed to, say, the first movie, where it was just, I mean, she was a protagonist, but she wasn't heroic, if that makes sense. Like, she was basically just trying to survive once she ends up getting involved with the Cenobites and what have you. Whereas here, she has a clear goal of trying to save her father, as well as trying to save her friend Tiffany. And Ashley Lawrence did a pretty good job of showing some growth that her character had from the first movie into this one. And I appreciated seeing that sense of maturity with her character. And she still looks good, by the way, in this movie. And it was also a joy to see Claire Higgins return as Julia once more, albeit this time as the quote-unquote wicked queen. And whereas in the first one, she was the wicked stepmother, and she even lampshades that, and I loved it. And it was really cool, seeing her character having a sense of power, and being kind of a mover and shaker in hell. I mean, yes, she was a servant of a Leviathan, but at the same time, I loved how she basically played Channard like a fiddle. And her little showdown with Kirsty, was, cool to see, and simply because Claire Higgins did such a good job of, playing, this, newly powered evil queen, or former evil stepmother to full-on evil queen. But Claire Hegan seemed to take the part and run with it. And Kenneth Cranham played Dr. Channard, and I thought he did a pretty good job too, because he sort of has this professional, polite facade, when he's in public, but when he's pursuing his true interests and obsessions, there's a sense of focus and intensity that comes into play, where that politeness that you see in his public persona becomes that much more terrifying, because you're like, okay, if this is what this guy's doing in his downtime, how many people is he sizing up for his experiments, that kind of thing. And so I think I actually liked him more, seeing him more in his human form, because you see a little bit more range with his character. But when he becomes a Cenobite, though, it's a bit interesting, because he does play, Kenneth Cranham does play Channard as a Cenobite, but only in, say, like close-up shots, because there was this rig that they used that unfortunately I think it hurt him or something, or it wouldn't work with him. And so there was like a stunt man that was all suited up as a Channard Cenobite, and whenever you see the Channard Cenobite being towed around by the organic appendage that Leviathan had ingrained into his drilled into his skull. But in the close-up shots, it's actually Kenneth Cranham made up to look like the Channard Cenobite. So, but when he's the Channard Cenobite, I mean, he looks good and everything, like really good makeup job. But I think that they relied too much on, say, his character taking on a hammy tone, like throwing out medical one-liners whenever he starts slicing people up and what have you. So I thought Kenneth Cranham did a good job. It's just, I think that they could have made his character a little more scary when it came to, say, when he was turned into a Cenobite. I mean, although he does get a good line in, right after he's been turned into a Cenobite, he's looking around saying, "And to think I hesitated." And in light of the context, it makes sense, and it's a good line. And I kind of wish that they'd gone more in that direction than, say, the almost Freddy Krueger-esque medical one-liners he starts spouting once the appendage gets drilled into his head. And then, of course, you have Doug Bradley, returning as Pinhead, or the lead Cenobite. And as I mentioned earlier, he and the Cenobites get more screen time this time around. I mean, not a whole lot more, but just enough to where they have more lines of dialogue and everything. And we also find out, semi-spoiler, but that it's not too much of a spoiler because it's shown at the beginning of the movie, especially with his character. But we find out that the Cenobites were once human, and namely with the character of Pinhead, he was a soldier from World War I, a British soldier named Captain Elliot Spencer. But to be fair, we don't find out that his name's Elliot Spencer until the third movie. But here though, I mean, we see the movie opens up with this flashback of Elliot Spencer, somewhere, we're assuming, somewhere like maybe India or something like that, toying with the Lamarchian configuration, and unfortunately for him, opening a door to hell and being taken there and turned into a Cenobite that we would all become known as Pinhead. And it's a pretty gruesome sequence too. But yeah, so we find out that the Cenobites were once human, but prior to that though, it was really cool seeing Doug Bradley getting to do more with his character. And he and the female Cenobite, who this time is played by a woman named Grace Kirby. Let's see. Let me make sure I got the name right. Grace Kirby was the actress who played the female Cenobite in the first movie. This time, an actress named Barbie Wilde plays her. And I liked how the female Cenobite got a little bit more dialogue this time around. And then, of course, you have Simon Bamford back as the Butterball Cenobite and Nicholas Vince as the Chatterer. And so, with the exception of Barbie Wilde, having replaced Grace Kirby, the original actors who played the Cenobites are back. And so Simon Bamford and Nicholas Vince, I mean, they can't really do much verbally because of the makeup and design of their costumes and everything, but it's good to see that they came back to portray those terrifying characters. But Doug Bradley and Barbie Wilde, they did a good job with their characters and giving more substance to them. And I liked how you saw that there was some intelligence with them, because we saw that in the first movie in the sense that they're willing to make a bargain with Kirsty when she's able to prove to them that, hey, one of your experiments escaped you. And so and then you, on the other hand though, you see it more this time around, because in the scene where they come upon Tiffany and they're about to do their thing with her, Pinhead's the one who stops them, because they're like, hey, something's not right here. Yeah, she opened the box, but look at her. I'm not, this isn't how he does it, but I'm just kind of like doing this weird thought process here. But basically, he looks at her and he's like, there's no way she's the one behind this. And sure enough, he's able to pick up on the fact that it was someone else who manipulated her into opening it. And so I like that bit of intelligence that the Cenobites have this time around, or we see more of it this time around. And I like the fact that because of that, they let her go. Now, granted, they don't stop her from wandering into hell after them, but they let her go in the sense that they don't kill or mutilate her or anything like that. And of course, when they come across Kirsty once more, it's really cool to see their interplay with one another, because it's like, on one hand, they're looking forward to torturing her because that's what they were wanting to do with her in the first movie, but at the same time, they're amused that she came to hell of her own volition and is looking for someone who isn't even there. And so they're kind of like, well, you're here, you may as well enjoy the scenery, but we'll find you later. It's that kind of thing. So that was interesting to see. But yeah, I also liked the whole idea of hell being portrayed as sort of this, labyrinthian, MC-esque landscape. Because you had some really good matte painting shots of this sort of like maze, this landscape that consists of mazes. And you got the Leviathan floating over everything, which makes for a very memorable visual. And of course, you have Christopher Young giving yet another wonderful score, but here, because I guess of the more epic tone of the movie, this score itself is far more grandiose. And so good on Christopher Young. And the movie still continues to look good, with Robin Vidgeon and his crew, doing their work with the photography and what have you. So you have some really good shots. You do have some moments, unfortunately, where, the special effects, partially because of, hey, they're special effects from the 80s, but also because the studio was going through budget problems at the time. There are moments where the special effects are kind of dodgy, but overall though the movie never fails to look good. And whether it be in the ordinary world, i.e. in the mental institution, or in hell, it looks very well put together. But I will say though that the couple of things that keep the movie from actually being good were the fact that it turns out that depending on how you interpret things, Kirsty's father Larry isn't even in hell at all, when she in fact went to hell specifically to try and rescue him. Now, granted, it does show that Frank was somehow able to send Kirsty these nightmarish visions, masquerading as Larry. But at the same time, though, when you find out that the person who she went to hell to rescue isn't even there in the first place, it sort of robs the movie of a certain amount of momentum. And so it's like the movie does a good job of building up the momentum when Kirsty is at the mental institution, and of course when Channard resurrects Julia and all that. And so the movie, it does a good job of going somewhere, and up until the point where everyone goes to hell. And as wonderful as hell looks in this movie, or I should say as as original and alien as hell looks in this movie, that's where the momentum tends to sag, though. And I think a big part of that was because, the fact that, Larry isn't even there in the first place. Or it could be that, Larry's in some other part of hell that Kirsty can't get to. But even if that were the case, I mean, there were a couple of things that kind of nagged me about that, is that, why would Larry be in hell at all? Or at the very least, if this was some version of hell, that was, made up, that kind of followed the rules that the Cenobites had, I mean, it makes sense that Julia would be there, since she's the one who helped Frank. She was an accomplice of his, and the Cenobites came to reclaim Frank, and they saw that Julia was the one who helped him out, so they take her. That makes sense. But why would Larry be there? Because he was literally an innocent victim who was murdered by Frank and Julia. And so, the idea that he would be in hell, or at least their version of hell, doesn't make any sense whatsoever, at least in my opinion. And so, I mean, I guess another way you can interpret it is that, I mean, some people say that, because of the Cenobites, experimentations, the fact their, pain and pleasure are indistinguishable from one another, maybe, Larry could very well be in a sort of heaven-like dimension, and to them, heaven is hell and hell's heaven, that kind of thing. I don't know. But the point is, the fact that Larry isn't even in hell, and Kirsty, went to the trouble of going to hell to try and find him, and finds that he's not even there, it's kind of like, well, what do we do now? That kind of thing. And so as a result, you have a bunch of people wandering around hell. And sure enough, I mean, there's some, fascinating imagery and visuals, but so it doesn't look uninteresting, but at the same time, not a whole lot happens, with a few exceptions. I mean, Channard being turned into a Cenobite, I mean, that was gruesome and memorable, to be sure. But then again, depending on your perspective, he kind of loses his presence he kind of loses his, I guess you could say, level of threat, once he turns into a Cenobite, in the sense that, I mean, yes, he's dangerous, but it's hard to take him seriously when he's constantly spouting medical one-liners. And so it's sort of hit or miss with his character. And so that kind of, comes to another part of the movie I didn't really care for. Okay, so as we know, the Cenobites, it turns out, they were once human, right? Well, there comes a point where they're made aware of their humanity, namely, the lead Cenobite, Pinhead. He's made aware of his humanity because, Kirsty had, found a photograph of his human form from World War I, and, recognized him, and she, proved to him that, hey, you weren't always like this, and showed it to him, and he's looking at it, and, I will say that the acting in the scene is very well done on Doug Bradley's part, because it's like he's at war with himself, trying to, on one hand, process this information, and then, when he reluctantly accepts it, it's a good bit of acting on all their parts, and I like that part. But then when the Channard Cenobite comes in, and to basically have his way with Tiffany and Kirsty, the Cenobites, they defend Kirsty and Tiffany, or at least they try to, and and they summon all these chains, these hooked chains that that they use as weapons, that we saw in the first movie, and unfortunately the chains don't really do jack against the Channard Cenobite, and that's partially because of the fact that they're remembering their humanity, and they're disoriented, and they're not operating at full power, because they're not operating under the sway of Leviathan anymore. But then when they choose to rebel against Leviathan and Channard as a result, they're operating against the will of their god, and so their god is using Channard, as an instrument to punish them. And so, I mean, it makes sense, but unfortunately, though, the way they go out is way too easy, and it would have been nice if, say, they had been able to put more of a fight against Channard, because I mean, I understand the reasoning behind them being weakened. It's like they're all, realizing that they were once human, and because of that, it's like they're trying to, protect, Kirsty and Tiffany from Channard. But when Channard just goes through them, like cake, it's just kind of like, we saw these terrifying, creations from the first movie, and they made an impression on us. And then we see more of them in this movie, and we're thinking that surely, they would be able to do more damage against Channard, but unfortunately they're taken out just like that. So, I mean, I'm not objecting to them being taken out. I just think that, maybe if, they'd been able to put more of a fight, I think it would, gone down better, so to speak. But, so yeah, I mean, those were the main flaws I had with the movie. Simply because, with Larry not being in hell at all, the movie's momentum, ends up sagging immensely, to a point where, we're, for the most part, left wandering around, hell, albeit with some, memorable sequences here and there. I mean, the bit where Kirsty, finds out that it's Uncle Frank who's tricking her. I mean, it's a well done scene, don't get me wrong. And we also find that, Sean Chapman back as Uncle Frank. And unlike the first movie where he was dubbed, we get to hear his real voice in this one. So, I mean, that part was pretty cool, but also that's the point where we find out that, nope, Larry's not even in hell at all. So she, went to hell to rescue her father for nothing. But yeah, overall though, I mean, I thought it was a solid sequel. That unfortunately, once it loses its momentum though, it kind of loses its power, in my opinion. So, but at the same time, it does do a lot to expand the lore of the Hellraiser mythos, and it was really cool, seeing some of the characters from the first movie, getting to have a little bit more meat to play with, so to speak. And I liked some of the new characters that were introduced as well. So, all in all, I'm going to go ahead and give Hellbound 3 out of 5 stars. It was a decent movie. I mean, but unfortunately, its momentum, really slows down, at the point where we find out that, Kirsty's father isn't even in hell in the first place. So, so as a result, the movie, bogs down, and it's kept from being good. But overall, though, because of what it does and what it's going for, it's a decent sequel. But you have a ton of bonus features on this Blu-ray here. You've got 2 good commentary tracks, one by director Tony Randel and writer Pete Adkins, and you also have another one with Randel and Adkins and Ashley Lawrence. And I think I really like that one, more because Ashley Lawrence, I mean, she's proven to be, really nice to listen to when it comes to commentary tracks, as you find out if you listen to the commentary for the first movie. But you also have Leviathan, the story of Hellbound Hellraiser 2, and it was actually a documentary for the movie, because of all the stuff that they had wanted to do, but they were unable to do for various reasons. And we find out a bunch of behind the scenes stuff, like the fact that Hellbound was supposed to have a higher budget than the first movie, which it did, but it unfortunately though it didn't have as high of a budget as they had planned on it, because the studio was going through some financial difficulties. And so that might explain why some of the special effects, I mean, while some of the special effects look good, some of them look pretty dodgy, and that's more than just them being dated from the 80s. But yeah, you also find out all sorts of stuff that they had some changes that they had made, like Doctor Channard was originally called Dr. Malahide and what have you, and there was like a whole subplot originally where Kirsty did find her father, and he's joined to Frank as this sort of Siamese, twin creature. And, Frank is in control, though. And so it follows the point of, Frank, basically tricked Kirsty into coming to hell so she can be a sex slave, by way of revenge, right? And basically, Larry would just be helpless to prevent anything. But, Larry ends up snapping out of it and, fighting his brother to a point that the Siamese creature, twin creature, just tears itself apart. And so, after that point, Kirsty and Tiffany would get Larry out of hell, and Julia would still kill, Frank. And the way the story was originally going to end, Channard, he'd still be, Channard, he was still a threat and everything, but it would be Julia who was more of a threat. In fact, they had wanted to have her be the main villain, going forward. But, Claire Higgins was like, no thanks, I've had enough of the Hellraiser universe. And so that's one of the main reasons why, going forward, Doug Bradley was basically the main focus of the Hellraiser series, even though he had a comparatively minor part in both 1 and 2. Like, he turned out to be one of the elements that fans connected with the most. And so I thought that was a bit interesting that, Claire Higgins was originally supposed to be the main villain going forward, because I really liked, her evil queen portrayal in this movie. So that would have been interesting to see, but that didn't happen. So you find out all this stuff from this documentary. So Leviathan, the story of Hellbound Hellraiser 2, very well done documentary. If you're a fan, whether old fan or new, definitely check that out on this Blu-ray here. But you also have, let's see here, Being Frank, Sean Chapman on Hellbound. And so basically he talks about what it was like, to come back in the role as Frank Cotton, and he also jokes about how it's nice they actually got to have his own voice this time, that kind of thing. So Sean Chapman, he seems like a chill, relaxed dude. So the interviews pretty laid back. But that was cool to see. And you also have let's see, give me a moment. There's a very poor quality deleted scene called the surgeon scene, which is something that in the script was supposed to be a pretty cool horror moment, but unfortunately they couldn't really get the special effects to work, and they originally scrapped the scene entirely. But there was some person who they had recorded some of the shots and everything, and so that's why the scene exists in some way, albeit in a very poor format. Let's see. And you also have Lost in the Labyrinth, and it's a vintage featurette which has interviews with Clive Barker, Tony Randel, Bob Keane, the special makeup effects guy, and Pete Adkins, and a lot of other people. And I vaguely remember, having watched that documentary, back when I first saw this movie on the original DVD release. So it was interesting watching that again after having watched the Leviathan documentary. So it was kind of like a flashback and a call forward, And then you have Under the Skin, Doug Bradley on Hellbound Hellraiser 2. And Doug Bradley, he's always, a cool guy to listen to. He always has good stories to tell. He's very, he has a very friendly demeanor, very charming, and much like his interviews from the special features on the first movie, it kind of carries over into the second movie. So once again, it's a delight to see Doug Bradley talk about the role that he's arguably most famous for, but maybe with a few more anecdotes, that kind of thing. And then you have of course you have some vintage interviews from the time that the movie was being made, and all sorts of other stuff. And so basically, if you're a fan of the movie, if you're a fan of Hellbound, definitely check out the Arrow Video Blu-ray release, because once again, Arrow is the equivalent of the Criterion Collection when it comes to horror movies. Like they made this stuff for the fans of the series, and so So you can definitely tell that it was put together, by people who actually cared about, the Hellraiser mythos and what have you. So, so very good. I should say it's an excellent, Blu-ray release. But yeah, so yeah, that was a Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, and it was a better sequel than I remembered it being, and it was a worthy one as well, even if it fell short of being good. But thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. You got any questions, comments, please drop a line and let me know. And if you like what you see here, please feel free to subscribe. So y'all have a good night. Take care. Bye.